There is a single stretch of days opening up in your garden right now, and most folks will let it slip by without ever knowing it was there. By the middle of July, the soil has been warming for weeks. It goes bone dry by noon, the sun sits heavy on your shoulders, and every instinct you have built over a lifetime is telling you the planting is behind you. Put the trowel away. Wait for fall. I want to tell you, as gently as I can, that the instinct is wrong, and it is quietly costing you 3 of the most beautiful months your backyard will ever hand you. Because the gardeners whose beds are still glowing in September, while the rest of the street has gone tired and brown, they are not luckier than you are. They did not spend more money than you did. They simply understood one thing about warm July soil, that the seed catalogs stopped reminding us of a long time ago. Today, I want to walk you through 12 flowers you can sow straight into the ground this month. No grow lights, no little plastic pots, no heavy bags of anything. And somewhere in this list is one plant that is not really about this fall at all. While it is blooming for you up top, it is quietly doing something underground that most gardeners are never told about. Something that changes the soil itself. I will tell you which one when we reach it. Stay with me for that part. And if you would, tell me down in the comments what corner of the country you garden in. Your zone changes the timing of nearly everything we are about to talk about, and I do like knowing who is out here with me. So let me start with the thing the garden center would rather you did not sit and think about too hard. There is a belief floating around that July is simply too late to start flowers from seed. And honestly, that belief is wonderful for business, just not yours. Because if you trust it, here is exactly what you will do. You will drive over to the garden center in the heat, and you will buy a flat of leggy, root-bound transplants for $3 or $4 a piece. Plants raised in a greenhouse, on a feeding schedule, crammed into a little plastic cell they have already outgrown, and you will bring them home and set them into your beds stressed, pot-bound, and sulking. Now here is the quiet truth. A packet of seeds costs about $2, and a flower sown straight into warm July soil, germinating fast, sending its roots down on its own terms, never once lifted or shocked, will very often outgrow and outbloom that expensive transplant by the time fall arrives. There was no transplant shock, because there was nothing to transplant. The plant simply grew where it was always going to live. And you cannot bottle warm soil. You cannot patent it. You cannot sell a gardener the same handful of July warmth every single spring. That, more than anything, is why nobody ever put it on a shelf and reminded you of it. It was never hidden from you in some vault. The market just had no reason to keep it in front of your eyes. Which brings me to the one idea underneath this whole list, the idea this little channel was built on. We are not really feeding these flowers at all. We are feeding the ground they grow in, and letting the ground do the rest. Dr. Linda Chalker Scott, the horticulturist at Washington State University, who has spent years separating real garden science from the folklore on the back of the bag, puts it about as plainly as it can be put. Most of the time, the answer was never one more product. It was the soil. Keep that in your back pocket. It is going to come up with nearly every flower we talk about. Let's start with the one I would hand to just about anybody. The flower that pays you back faster than almost anything else you can drop in warm soil. Zinnias. Here is what makes a zinnia perfect for right now. It hates the cold. A zinnia seed dropped into cool spring ground just sits there and sulks, and sometimes it rots before it ever wakes up. But that same seed, pressed into July soil that has been soaking up heat for weeks, soil sitting somewhere around 70 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, that seed cracks open and pushes up a little seedling in 4 to 5 days. After all these years, it still makes me smile every single time. Now, a word on choosing. If you want tidy, bushy plants that will not flop over in an August storm, look at the Profusion series. They are All America Selections winners, they stay low, they branch like mad, and they shrug off disease. If you are after those big, dinner plate cut flowers, the kind a florist would charge you a small fortune for, look instead at the Benary's Giant series. And here is the golden harvest part. The mistake I watch good gardeners make every year. They love that zinnia so much, they nearly kill it with kindness. They dig in rich compost. They pour on the fertilizer. They want to give it everything. Please don't. A zinnia in heavy, rich, overfed soil grows tall and soft and floppy. And worse, It becomes a magnet for powdery mildew, that gray dust that ends more late-season zinnias than anything else. Give it plain, average, well-draining soil instead. Press the seeds in about a 1/4 inch deep because they want warmth and a little light, so do not bury them. And when the seedlings crowd up thick, thin them out. I know it feels cruel to pull a healthy little sprout. Do it anyway. Crowded zinnias get sick. Zinnias with room to breathe get glorious. Number 2, cosmos. If zinnias are the workhorse, cosmos are the dancers. Airy, tall, swaying on the lightest breeze, the way those expensive ornamental grasses only wish they could. And cosmos will teach you something that runs against everything we were ever told about feeding a plant. Cosmos came up out of the lean, dry scrublands of Mexico. Poor soil is its native tongue, so if you treat it like a pampered vegetable, with rich compost and a nice dose of fertilizer, it does the very opposite of what you would hope. It pours all of that richness straight into leaves. You end up with a 4-foot bush, lush and green, and proud and almost no flowers on it. The Old Farmer's Almanac says it about as gently as I can. Rich soil gives you foliage at the expense of blooms. So here is how you do it. Speak its language. Lean, ordinary soil. No fertilizer. Scatter the seeds right on the surface or barely cover them, about a 1/4 inch, because they need a little light to wake up. Water them in soft. Thin them to a good 12 to 18 inches once they are a few inches tall, and then step back and let them be a little hungry. A hungry cosmos is a flowering cosmos. From a July sowing, you are looking at blooms from late August right on through the fall, and they will drop their seed and very likely come back to greet you next year, free of charge. Number 3, sunflowers. And I want to clear up a misunderstanding I hear every single year, that sunflowers are a spring-only flower, and if you missed May, you missed your chance. That simply is not true, and believing it has cost a lot of gardeners the finest fall color they never knew they could have had. Sown into warm July soil, a sunflower comes up fast, in 5 to 7 days, and then it runs. It never has to crawl through that cold, slow, sulking spell a spring-sown sunflower fights through. By the time late August rolls around, and the rest of the garden is looking a little weary, your sunflowers are just hitting their stride. The trick in July is to choose the quick ones, because your runway to frost is shorter now than it was in spring. Look for varieties that mature in about 55 to 70 days. Autumn Beauty, for those branching bronze and gold blooms, or the pro-cut types if you want clean single stems for cutting. And here is the one mistake that breaks hearts: leaving those fresh-sown seeds unguarded. Squirrels, chipmunks, and birds will strip a sunflower bed clean before you ever see a sprout. So for the first week or 10 days, lay an old piece of window screen or a light row cover right over the row, weighted down with a couple of stones. The moment the seedlings have their first true leaves, the worst of the danger has passed. It costs you nothing, and it saves you the whole heartbreak. Number 4, the French marigold. And this is the one I promised you back at the very start. The plant that is doing something underground you will never see. We tend to think of marigolds as a cheerful little border, and they are that. But down at their roots, certain marigolds release a natural compound, and its name is alpha-terthienol. That compound is quietly hostile to root knot nematodes, the microscopic worms that swell up the roots of your tomatoes and peppers and rob them from below. This is not garden folklore. The Extension Service at the University of Florida has a whole publication on using marigolds against nematodes. But because we keep it honest in this garden, let me give you the whole truth and not the bumper sticker version. This works best when you grow your marigolds thickly, a real patch of them, alive and actively growing, not 3 lonely plants at the corner of a bed. And it depends on which nematode and which marigold you are dealing with. They are a powerful tool, not a magic wand. Still, plant a good block of French marigolds in July, let them grow, and you are gardening on 2 clocks at once. Flowers for your eyes this fall, and ground that is a little cleaner and kinder for whatever you set there next spring. On a $2 packet, that is about the smartest bit of soil work you can do all year. And one honest correction you will hear repeated, even by good channels: those root knot nematodes are worms, not insects, so no spray ever stopped them from the air. The marigold reaches them where they actually live, down in the soil. Sow the seeds a quarter-inch deep, give them full sun because they sulk in shade, and thin them to about 8 or 10 inches apart. Now, before we go on, I want to give you something. Everything we are covering today I have gathered onto a single page, the whole July sowing chart. Which flower, how deep, how many days to sprout, how far apart, and the one honest note that matters most for each. It is made to be printed out and taped right inside your shed door or tucked into your garden journal. If you would like it, just point your phone at the code on the screen and it is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay right here, because the next flower is one almost nobody bothers to grow, and once you understand what it does, you are going to wonder why. Number 5. Nasturtiums. People underrate this one badly. They see an old-fashioned cottage flower and walk right past one of the most useful plants you can grow. Like cosmos, the nasturtium wants to be a little neglected. Give it rich soil and you get a lovely mound of round green leaves and hardly a bloom. But give it lean, ordinary soil, the kind your fussier plants would turn their noses up at, and that nasturtium covers itself edge to edge in jewel-toned flowers. The plant senses lean times and decides it had better hurry up and make seed. And to make seed, it has to make flowers. You are simply working with its instincts instead of against them. And here is the part the garden industry never quite gets around to mentioning. Every bit of a nasturtium is edible. The flowers are peppery and bright on a salad. The young leaves taste like a mild watercress. And the green seed pods, pickled, stand in beautifully for capers. It is a fine trap crop, too. Aphids will swarm the nasturtium and leave your vegetables in peace. One $2 packet hands you a cut flower, a salad green, and a bodyguard for the garden, all at once. In the hottest zones, give it a little afternoon shade so the leaves do not scorch. Jewel for compact mounds, or a climbing mix to run it up a trellis. Number 6. Calendula, the pot marigold, though it is no relation at all to the French marigold we just talked about. This is a flower that actually loves what is coming. You sow it in the warmth of July, it sprouts fast, in 5 to 10 days, and then, as the nights cool into September and October, it shifts into its happiest, heaviest blooming of all. Now, you will hear calendula talked about as a great medicinal herb, and I want to be careful and honest with you here, the way I always try to be. Calendula has a long, gentle history in the home. Folks have used the petals in their cooking, and traditionally in simple skin salves going back generations. That is heritage, and it is folklore, and it is a lovely part of the plant's story. But I am not going to stand here and make you any health promises about it. That is a conversation for you and your own doctor, not for a garden video. What I can tell you for the garden is this. That sticky resin on calendula's stems actually traps soft-bodied pests like aphids, so it earns its keep as a quiet little protector among your vegetables, and the bees and the hoverflies simply adore it. The seeds are big and curved, almost like little claws, so they are easy to handle. Sow them about a quarter-inch down, keep them moist while they sprout, thin to about 10 inches, and enjoy one of the last warm colors, still standing when the frost finally comes. Pacific Beauty and Indian Prince are lovely places to start. Number 7. Sweet Alyssum. This humble little carpet of a flower fell out of fashion when the big, showy plants took over, and that was a real loss, because alyssum quietly does work in a garden that almost nothing else its size can match. Here is its secret for a July sowing. Alyssum is a cool season soul. Sow it now, and it will come up in the warm soil, then hunker down and sulk a bit through the worst of the August heat, and then, the moment September cools things off, it explodes into a low, honey-scented blanket of bloom. You are essentially preloading your fall garden right now. But the real magic is who those tiny flowers call in. Researchers at Oregon State University planted alyssum right into broccoli fields and watched it draw in hoverflies and tiny stingless parasitic wasps. And a single hoverfly larva will eat hundreds of aphids before it is even grown. Now, in true honest fashion, even those researchers will tell you it is no silver bullet. Some seasons the timing lines up better than others. But a ribbon of alyssum along your beds is not decoration. It is a little standing army of pest control, built for $2 and half an hour of your time. The seeds are dust fine. Scatter them on the surface, press them down with your palm, and do not cover them, because they need light to wake. Carpet of snow is the classic. Easter bonnet handles the July heat a bit better. Number 8. Borage. Now, if you have been with me a while, you have heard me be honest about borage before, and I am going to stay honest about it, because that is the whole point of this place. Here is what borage does better than almost anything alive. It feeds bees. Professor Dave Goulson, the bumblebee biologist over at the University of Sussex, has pointed out that a borage flower refills its nectar just a couple of minutes after a bee drinks it dry. So a single plant becomes a little well that never runs out, right through late summer, when so many other flowers have already quit for the year. For the bees in your corner of the world, in the lean weeks of fall, that matters more than you might think. But I will give you the same honest cautions I always do. Borage self-seeds with real enthusiasm. One tidy plant this year can carpet that bed next spring. So snip off the spent flowers if you would rather keep it in bounds. Its leaves and stems carry coarse little bristles that can leave thinning. Older skin itchy and red. So wear your gloves and your long sleeves when you handle it. And grow it for the bees, not for the dinner plate. In this garden, it is a pollinator plant, not a salad. Sow it about a ½ inch down. Give it a good 18 inches of room so the air can move through, and let it do the one thing it does better than nearly anything else. Keep your bees fed. Number 9. The California poppy. I love this one, because it asks almost nothing of you. It just needs you to leave it be. This is a true native of the western half of this continent. It grew up with these soils and these seasons, long before there was ever a garden center to sell it back to us. The single most important thing to know is that a California poppy sends down a taproot almost the moment it sprouts, and it cannot stand to have that root disturbed. Lift it out of a nursery pot, and you will set it back hard, or kill it outright. So with this flower, the seed packet is not just the cheaper way. It is the only right way. Scatter the seeds on the surface, because they need light. Press them gently into good contact with the soil, and water soft. In about 7 to 14 days, there they are. And then it simply takes care of itself. It shrugs off drought and deer and rabbits. It blooms in poor, rocky ground that would starve a fussier plant. It closes its petals at dusk and on gray days to keep its pollen dry, and opens them right back up when the sun returns. And here is the part I love best. One good plant drops enough seed to fill a whole bed next year, and that bed fills the next. You buy the packet once. After that, the poppy does the arithmetic for you, every single year, a gift that keeps on giving, and a quiet feast for our native bees besides. Thai silk and mission bells will carry you well past the plain orange you might already know. Number 10. Tithonia, the Mexican sunflower. If your summers come in hot, and you have got the room, this is your champion. It positively loves the kind of heat that would wilt other plants, germinating happily in soil, up into the mid-80s, and it grows into something downright magnificent. A towering branching bush, 4, 5, sometimes 6 feet tall, lit up with fiery orange blooms. But here is why I really want you to grow it. Come late summer and fall, when the monarch butterflies are making their long journey south, Tithonia is one of the great filling stations along the way. Stand near a Tithonia in September and you will see them. Monarchs, swallowtails, bumblebees, all of it, working the blooms. You do not baby this plant. You do not feed it. You give it sun, you give it space, and you let it become a wild, glowing way station for everything with wings. If room is tight, sow it after the others. It grows fast enough to catch right up. Number 11. Rudbeckia, the black-eyed Susan. And with this one, I have to be straight with you about time, because honesty about the timeline is exactly the thing that builds trust. Most of the flowers on this list are annuals. They will blaze through this one fall and then be gone with the hard frost. Rudbeckia plays a longer game. Sow it into the warm July soil, and it will come up and spend this whole season doing something you mostly cannot see, building a deep, tough, drought-proof root system down in the dark. You may get only leaves this first year, and I will not pretend otherwise, but that is not a failure. That is an investment. Next summer, and the summer after that, those roots send up an unstoppable wave of golden, dark-eyed blooms that ask almost nothing of you, and feed the native bees and the goldfinches besides. There is a particular kind of patience that gardening grows in us as the years go on. The willingness to plant something today whose best gift will not arrive until a season or two down the road. Rudbeckia is that very lesson, wearing yellow petals. Sow it shallow, give it sun, and trust the wait. And number 12, the hollyhock. I saved it for last on purpose, because for so many of us, it is not really a flower at all. It is a memory. Those tall spires standing against a weathered fence, the ones that grew by the back door of a grandmother's house. That is the hollyhock. Like the black-eyed Susan, it asks for a little patience. The hollyhock is a biennial. Sow it now, in July, and this first year it simply grows a low rosette of leaves and gathers its strength. Then next summer it sends up those magnificent towers, 5 and 6 feet tall, hung with saucer-sized blooms from the ground, clear up to the sky, opening from the bottom upward over weeks and weeks. The seeds need light to sprout, so press them onto the surface and do not bury them. And here is a gift you might not expect. The hollyhock is a host plant for the painted lady butterfly. The caterpillars actually grow up on its leaves. So you are not only planting a flower, you are raising the next generation of butterflies right there by the fence. I will keep it honest, the way I always do. Hollyhocks can catch a bit of rust on their lower leaves late in the season, so water them at the base, not over the top, and you will keep it well at bay. They will self-seed and settle in, the way they did along all those old fences. Plant them now, and you are quietly sending a letter ahead to next summer. So look at what these 12 all share, because it is the whole heart of the thing. Every single one of them goes straight into the ground as a seed. Not a transplant, not a tray, started weeks ago under a grow light. A seed, set into the warm summer earth, rooting on its own terms, blooming on nature's own schedule, right on into the fall. You do not need more space for any of this. You do not need a bigger budget, or a greenhouse, or one more expensive gadget on the shelf. You need a handful of $2 packets and one warm afternoon. And the deeper you let this one idea settle in, that we are tending the soil and letting the soil tend the plant, the easier and the cheaper and the more honest your whole garden becomes. I told you at the very start that there was one plant on this list quietly working underground. And by now you know it was the marigold, mending the very ground beneath your feet for next year's tomatoes. But the honest truth is, every flower we talked about today is doing some version of that same work, feeding the soil, feeding the bees, leaving the ground a little more alive than it found it. I learned that the slow way myself. For years I fussed over my plants the way the catalogs told me to, feeding them, pushing them, fixing them. It took me far too long to understand that the best gardeners I ever knew were not really feeding their plants at all. They were feeding the dark living ground underneath them and trusting it to do the rest, the way it always has. If that is the kind of gardening you come from, or the kind you would like to grow into, then you already belong here. Subscribe, and let's keep tending the old, honest way, together. Now go find one bare patch out there, pick just 1 or 2 of these, and put a few seeds in the warm ground today. Come September, when your yard is humming and glowing and the neighbors are wondering how on earth you did it, you are going to be so glad that you did.